Hi, it's Jim. Although we recorded this last year about this time, the issues related to attacks on civic infrastructure have not improved. Some would argue they might have gotten worse. So the show that we did is just as relevant, maybe more than it was then. Here's what we called a hacker's look at civic infrastructure. My guest is Nick Aleks. He's the author of Black Hat Bash and a founder of DEF CON Toronto, and at the time, he described himself as the chief hacking officer at Aleks Security. Don't worry, Nick is one of the good guys, but he knows how hackers think. And as he takes us on this tour, it shows. I don't think enjoy is the right word, but I hope you'll find it enlightening. You arrive in a city. Any other visitor would have come in by plane or even train, or maybe they drove in. If you're a regular tourist, you probably see the downtown, the city hall, other civic buildings. You might see the office towers, or the neighborhoods, the high-rise towers, the condos and apartments, and there may be parks and even a waterfront. And you're thinking about seeing the sights, restaurants, clubs, museums, galleries, sports facilities, all the things there are to do. But not for you. You're a different type of visitor. You're a hacker. You didn't even need to arrive physically, although you might be there. What's your first view of the city? And Nick, what do you think?
What does a hacker see when they look at a city and its infrastructure? Some of the things I see are very familiar. I see networks, computers, data, very juicy data. But I see some unique things. I see capabilities, whether they're digital only or physical. The way I would look at a city is first by doing a network scan, seeing what open Wi-Fi networks I have around me, what physical ports are open. Once I start lingering inside the network, are there any IP cameras available? Do they have default credentials enabled? Is it possible to view the city from same systems used to protect it? Are there gates, bollards, fences that can be remotely operated through web applications? These are all sort of things that I would be looking at when putting on my hacker hood inside our new modern cities.
And we always see that, we see this on TV, man, but you're saying you could actually pick up the cameras, you could actually realistically think about getting into a camera network and viewing what was happening around the city?
Yes. As a penetration tester, I go through the proper, ethical channels of evaluating smart infrastructure, critical infrastructure, OT, IoT devices. And yes, the exact same vulnerabilities and infrastructure misconfigurations that we have on our office networks and data centers is present. And I must say, even in a worse condition in some of our critical infrastructure components. Think about some of the recent trends and activities that we've been seeing with hospitals, libraries, casinos, and hotels all facing ransomware incidents and attacks. Hackers are already in these networks, and they're seeing that they are essentially a playground. Endless targets to choose from. The networks are massive, and the impacts are equally massive when it comes to getting access to some of these devices. Now, why would a bad actor target some of our cities? Number one, you've got access to a plethora of data about tenants, employees, folks who are inside some of these buildings and institutions. But you've also got these capabilities of remotely unlocking the front door or the gates to gain physical access into some of these facilities. Some of the other reasons why bad actors have been targeting a lot of our infrastructure is also to use it as launching points for pivoting to other targets. think of setting up an entire malicious botnet by just compromising the same vulnerability in all of the IP cameras in a particular facility. And then all those IP cameras being used to launch a DDoS attack against your true targets. So there's a lot of different reasons why bad actors jump into some of these networks.
Wow. Well, let's just so we've taken a look at the camera infrastructure. And I presume we're not going to share enough to tell anybody how to do this sort of thing, but I presume most of it you're counting on they're just default passwords, pretty easy to get past.
A lot of the time, default passwords are the way in which I get into a lot of these networks and particularly cameras. But there's a lot of cameras out there that are running very old firmware versions. They're very outdated. They've got critical vulnerabilities that are just sitting there unpatched. And a lot of our third and fourth party suppliers that provide these IoT or OT technologies to some of our facilities, they don't have an incentive to patch them. And so whether they're default credentials or just really low hanging fruit vulnerabilities that have known CVEs for years, these are some of the ways in which we get into some of these smart IoT, OT devices.
Can you, besides controlling these IoT devices, can you launch to somewhere else in the network from there? Or is that sort of, it's just really playtime with those devices?
Yeah, bingo. It's not just, having compromised the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of those particular systems themselves, but because a lot of these networks are very flat and they're not isolated from one another, it's really easy for a bad actor to laterally move from an IP camera to a local security guard workstation to be, local BAS building automation systems within a network, because there aren't a lot of these best practices of segregation between some of these networks. So lateral movement is pretty prevalent.
Rob, and you talked about just doing a regular scan from around. A friend of mine who's also a security guy just loved to check out the local Wi-Fi networks because they were so easy to get into. I presume people in coffee shops and using Wi-Fi all around are at least pretty easy to get into and start to pick up the traffic that's going back and forth to the city office itself.
Yeah, so there's multiple different entry points, Wi-Fi being one of them. A lot of the networks might be freely available to local customers or tenants or employees. Bluetooth is also another big way in. Another way in which bad actors can get into these networks and techniques that I've used is just running a showdown search for a particular geography and a facility. This is how you can essentially get to the heart of a lot of these IoT devices through a public-facing IP address.
Wow. And more, I guess people are we have all of the systems that run transit, traffic, all of that sort of thing. Are they vulnerable as well?
Yep, 100%. These transit traffic systems, a lot of them are connected with IP in their backends, but they'll also use like radio frequency technology. As we all know, the Flipper Zero is getting a lot of coverage right now for being banned here in Canada. And I've got my own thoughts about that policy decision. But radio is also a really big technology used in a lot of our critical infrastructure, and certain technology that isn't thinking about some of the attack avenues in which a bad actor will manipulate either wireless protocols or physical access to some of these systems. Because a lot of these critical junction boxes, smart meters, they've got just a tiny little insecure lock. And so if you can't get into it wirelessly or remotely, sometimes just having a little lockpick is another way into a lot of these server rooms, racks. And that's where you can easily plug in something like a Raspberry Pi that phones home to your command and control server. And from there, you're able to laterally move from the network because you've sort of breached into that trusted boundary, which is just a small little tiny lock.
And a lot of our audience will know what a Raspberry Pi is, but these are really tiny and relatively cheap and yet sophisticated computers.
Yep. And they're pretty discreet as well, especially when you put a little piece of tape on them that says IT, do not remove.
Oh God. Yeah. That's like walking around with a clipboard. Nobody's going to stop you. You know? Or I guess it's a tablet now. You walk around with a tablet instead of a clipboard.
Yep. But there's a lot of other technology that pen testers are using now to evaluate facilities. It's not just the Raspberry Pis.
You talked about the flipper. Can we just chat about that for a second and then move on to the other ones? Because the flippers made the news. People have apparently, it's been outlawed by the Canadian government because supposedly you could hack a car with it, although provided your car was from the 1990s or earlier. Is that, those things are relatively easily available still.
I have to give it out to the folks who developed the Flipper Zero. They built out a product that was like really easy to use and easy to advertise and market on things like TikTok, where I'm sure some of the politicians and folks who've banned it first got wind of it. But the actual technology behind the Flipper Zero is essentially just a radio. These are things that, we've had for a while in the hacker community, the HackRF, the Yardstick ones, SDRs, software-defined radios. These are all technologies that are also out there that aren't banned, which could be used to break into a lot of our radio frequency supported infrastructure. Now, cars, especially modern ones, use rolling codes, which make it really hard for just a Flipper Zero that's not using active jamming to break into a vehicle. But that doesn't mean that that device or using radio frequency tools to replay attacks isn't going to open up a gate or bollard that has a static code associated with it. So doing these radio frequency replay attacks is also another way that bad actors can try to manipulate their digital and physical surroundings.
Wow. And you were going to talk about some other devices. I interrupted you. Sorry.
Hey. Yeah. Another great one that I absolutely love using in a lot of these smart building facilities are drones.
Mm-hmm.
Drones are a little eye in the sky. They can even have a Raspberry Pi associated with them. So I don't have to be in the parking lot with my laptop trying to break into the wireless network. I can just fly a drone from like a kilometer away, drop it on top of the roof of the facility, and start running some scans and start capturing some packets. So drones are also another great way to break into some of these smart buildings.
Before we get to the buildings, and I do want to get there, but the municipal infrastructure is generally based on ways that serve the citizen, either for websites you sign up for hockey games, all those sorts of things. How vulnerable are most of those systems?
They're pretty vulnerable, the ones that I've seen, at least. A lot of these systems don't have security as a top requirement when they're being built out and developed. And they tend to have a lot of outdated vulnerabilities and misconfigurations. A lot of the time, there's not a lot of budget with some of these projects, and they'll bring in third-party contractors or firms to quickly, rapidly build out a prototype, which then tends to go into production and be used. These applications that store customer information need to really think about how to secure it from an encryption perspective, and how to even try to detect an attack or malicious activity that could come from like a bad actor scanning it or trying to abuse any of their endpoints. But yeah, I tend to see that a lot of these applications are vulnerable to just some of the basic attacks that pen testers will use.
And keeping in the opportunity area for our visiting hacker, healthcare facilities seem to be just the perfect, and I've talked about this before, these does get publicized a lot. There's a whole section of Southwestern Ontario hospitals that were shut down, and which also have no recovery plan that I can see as well. So getting into like the not-for-profits, the healthcare sector, all of those things seems to be like,
it's unfortunate when a hospital is knocked out and it's not able to provide the service for its patients. It causes real impact to our societies. And one of the things that is sort of the leading cause is that a lot of these networks just have a large attack surface. They have a lot of different devices. They have a really big, wide network. And all it takes is for one single misconfiguration, one vulnerability that's not patched or really looked at by the IT team, and it could cause the entire facility to be disrupted. there's a lot of technology that we rely on for our hospitals to run in an effective manner. And even the smallest little blip of availability or even the slightest digit of a byte flipping from 0 to 1 could impact the integrity of a lot of these systems that we heavily rely on. I'd say that the just sheer size of these networks and the attack surface is what leads to their demise.
And full of devices that are relatively simple to hack. I mean, most medical devices that I've seen anyway, and I'm not an expert in it, but most of the ones I've ever seen they're just really unprotected Linux systems. They're relatively easy I could get into them, for heaven's sakes, in many cases.
Yeah, exactly. Some of the reasons why is because they need to fit a certain form factor. They've got requirements to be like very low powered, which will cause them to have limitations on the security side. They won't be able to log as much. They might have limitations from an encryption perspective. So there's a lot of these trade-offs that some of these devices have when it comes to some of the requirements for being low power, small form factor. But there are those trade-offs that do happen. And yeah, I think that with a lot of stuff running Linux, I'd be ashamed if I didn't plug my second book, Black Hat Bash. The best pen testers out there really know how to operate within an environment without bringing in their clunky pen testing tools and software. And our latest book, Black Hat Bash, with No Starch Press, co-authored by myself and Dola Farhai, really teaches folks how to live off the land in a Linux environment using the binaries pre-baked into some of these distributions to do things like port scanning, data exfiltration, and even evading defenses. So 100% bad actors are starting to learn how to operate within these small, limited resource environments. And this is exactly where some of our healthcare facilities get compromised.
Wow. Stepping back a little bit more on our tour, you've got all of these operational facilities. One of the ones I've read a lot about, water treatment facilities, all of those automated facilities like that seem to be a fair game and being attacked. There have been a number of attacks on water systems and other places. And this is serious stuff. We depend on these things to function well, to provide us with fresh water and other services. Relatively easy to get to, relatively easy to get into, it seems.
Some of these systems, these PLC controllers that are connected to workstations, they've got a lot of vulnerabilities associated with them. Now, I know that there's a lot of vendors in this space that do their best to patch some of these systems, such as Siemens and other vendors that operate in these spaces. But these are prime targets for nation state hackers. They are looking for ways to break into our critical infrastructure to cause damage to Canadians. And these vendors are really going up against a hacker or group of hackers who are well-funded, who have all the patience in the world, and who really are motivated to get into some of these facilities from a strategic perspective. And so it's really a difficult problem. It's a tough job to have that sort of adversary to be defending yourself against. And it's really going to take a collective approach of inviting the hackers to continuously test some of these critical infrastructure components that run our water, our lights, our hydro, but then also collaborating with the public sector and the private sector. So inviting our hackers to come and almost be our immune system against some of these systems and to actively test them on a continuous basis. That's really some of the best approaches that I can recommend that will help protect us in our critical infrastructure from attacks.
Wow. So you're saying we need a better partnership with hackers themselves or people to defend or to find our vulnerabilities and protect against them?
I'm not someone who's typically a compliance checkbox chaser. The way I like to secure systems is by pragmatically breaking into them myself. And if I can do it, most likely other folks can do it as well. Usually a lot of folks like to follow, security best practices and check boxes or checklists. And I see that as like building a castle, but doing it with a blindfold on. You really start to take that blindfold off when you invite folks to actively poke at where you're putting your bricks. Is there a crack in the wall here? Is there a hole over there? And by building our critical infrastructure in collaboration with pen testers and ethical hackers and inviting them to bring some of their creative tips, tricks, and tools, are we really able to continuously build security into our critical infrastructure?
Yeah. And I want to go back to the cure for this in a second, but I don't want to miss one point. And that is, so many of our buildings now are smart buildings. And does that create the vulnerability that I think it does?
Yes, it does. And this is definitely my specialty, smart buildings. They are all the rage here in Toronto. Just like a car with all of its bells and whistles and features, consumers are actively engaged and looking for the next best iPhone and looking for that sort of technology chase in their everyday life, whether it be in vehicles or in what we're now seeing, an increasing adoption of smart buildings. Now, what folks don't understand is that a lot of these smart buildings are not really thinking about security as a top priority. They come with a lot of different technologies, a lot of different IoT devices that are all interconnected in a flat network, just like in some of the civic and critical infrastructure items that we discussed. But they don't have the big IT security departments. That awareness is not there at the condo board levels. They don't really know what the impacts could be if their smart building were to be hacked. And worse yet, they probably wouldn't even know if a bad actor was in their smart building network till it was too late. Some of the biggest impacts and risks that smart buildings face is obviously the information about the tenants can be exfiltrated. It can be complete ransomware of the facility itself. Think about an elevator that's shut down as there's folks inside of it, and a ransom note pops up on the smart screen saying, pay this amount of money in this Bitcoin or else I'm not opening up this elevator for you. There could be real equipment damage as a part of some of these smart building attacks, reputational damages, and even risk to the safety or lives of the tenant and employees in these buildings. I think that it's not going to become a top of mind concern for a lot of tenants and manufacturers until something really bad happens and it's too late.
And you've talked about flat networks, which I presume means the networks where people can travel horizontally. They can get from one device to the other very easily. You're not segmented. Nothing's segmented off so that you easily skip from one place to another. And that's normally how hackers come in. They'll come in and they'll find various places, check things out, spend a long time there and figure everything out so they can a mass attack in there. And I don't want to be an alarmist or anything, but is it possible that somebody would be thinking about even, getting a number of buildings that they were going to command and execute that all at once?
I mean, a lot of these networks are just ripe for the hacking, and they are open and flat. And we've seen a lot of bad actors in the past use this method of collecting a bunch of compromised targets, either through malware or actively exploiting vulnerabilities, to launch these massive botnet attacks. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of bad actors that are already in some of these smart buildings, sitting there, collecting data, waiting for the right opportunity to potentially launch an attack against a target of theirs. It's a difficult problem. I think that one of the things that folks should really look at is continuously monitoring and detecting for anomalies in these networks. But there's nothing stopping a bad actor from sitting in a network for a really long time.
I was talking to somebody, a CISO for quite a large firm, and I was talking about the fact that I live in a very small town, still a lot of manual, there's still a lot of paper around here. And I was sort of laughing about the security by obscurity type of thing. He said, don't kid yourself. He said, a lot of these smaller towns could be equally impacted by an attack. So it's not just a big city thing. This is something where most civic infrastructures are vulnerable.
Big or small, If it's smart, it's probably vulnerable.
I don't want to leave everybody with this, but I did want to give that assessment because I think it's a fair one that our cities are far more vulnerable than we think. And the smarter they get, the more vulnerable they are. What are the things that most should be done in civic infrastructure? If you had your list of 5 things or whatever it is, what would you do first, putting on your Nick the Defender hat this time?
But the first thing that I would do is really, as I mentioned before, build that collaboration piece. This is not a problem that can be solved by any one particular party. I think that building awareness with tenants, consumers, developers, system integrators, and operators of some of these facilities is going to take time, but we need to work together in order to do it. So putting together the right forums and the right committees to do so, and having more events like this are really the first step in solving this crisis.
Getting that discussion and getting people involved in it, getting hackers or people who've got the expertise to actually understand the vulnerabilities of these systems, getting those discussions going. What are the next things that people should be doing?
Yeah, some of the other things that folks should be doing, like especially in the smart building side, is just ensure that the default credentials are not set on a lot of these IoT devices. Just change the default password. That's one of the lowest hanging fruit that even allows some of the most junior of hackers to get into a network and really cause havoc. So ensure that devices are configured properly and also kept up to date. When a vendor, third party, fourth party does push out a patch, take the time out to upgrade some of these devices. And then finally, as you're looking to either move from, your smart building to another smart building, following the best practices for how to wipe your data, properly clean it up, do factory resets. That's also really important. You want to make sure that you're always cleaning up your data and also requesting that your data be deleted if some of these smart systems are collecting and putting it into the cloud. I think from a developer and system integrator perspective, as I mentioned, bringing in hackers is really great throughout the process, but thinking about security from day one. And I think that if you are building technology that's going to go into a lot of our critical infrastructure, facilities, water treatment plants, or you're building technology for smart buildings, thinking about security from day one means do a threat modeling exercise. That's where you map out, what your solution or what your system looked like, talking about what the data flows look like, what the different user roles and actions and activities look like, but then think about what could go wrong. I ask everyone to sort of put on their hacker hood and think about the worst possible case scenarios of, okay, how could we compromise the confidentiality of the system, the integrity or the availability of it, and try to address that in your final product or in your system. And then please invest in patching and upgrading these systems once they're out there in the wild. We need to get out of this vicious cycle of just shipping a really poor product that's insecure, and instead of fixing it, saying, oh, we've got the 2.0 version, which you should buy instead, which has, a little bit better security. That's something we really need to break. And I think we need to start voting with our wallets when it comes to vendors that really take security seriously here.
Yeah. And for your OT or your operational technology or your, that sort of technology that you've got out there, people should be doing reviews of these to see what security enhancements are possible I know there's been a lot of work done to bridge the OT gap. These systems are no longer as unprotected as they can be, unless you've got old ones, or maybe you're just not spending the time and energy on, or not, I don't time and energy, but you're not investing the time or the money to upgrade them. Is that something people should be looking at as well?
Yes, 100%. Take the time out, take the energy to invest in security for our OT systems. Bring in a fresh set of eyes on the problem as well. Bring in, the hackers that are used to breaking into them and let them tell you exactly where and how they do that. This is going to allow us to fall forward in this sort of problem rather than staying stagnant So that would be my best advice.
I could see a next technicity, we might do one of these satellites just as a hackathon for cities, just to demonstrate what could happen. Because I think that you've really opened up hopefully you've opened a lot of eyes in terms of the level of vulnerability and some of the things people can do about it. Can we end with people though? Because I think we tend to focus on the technology. There's still lots of vulnerability. I talked about, people using insecure systems in coffee shops, all those sorts of things. What are the things that civic authorities should be looking to their people to say, these are the things you must do?
Yeah. I'd say number one, we need to start building a stronger culture around security and talking about it openly. When we all start to embrace this hacker mindset of how things can get compromised or how things can go wrong, that's when we really start to put the right investments. Oftentimes, when we think about the behaviors of folks, especially in the security community, it's usually when a breach happens or something really bad happens is when the people really get engaged and fired up to solve a particular problem. Incentivizing folks to be a part of the solution from day one, being a part of this community, build out like a group of champions who really want to see this problem be resolved and incentivize them. If regular civilians and folks find issues or ways to improve the security posture, let's find ways to reward and incentivize that. It's going to take a lot of education and awareness. And I really hope that action doesn't have to come out of something bad happening, but 100% educating folks, collaborating with them. I tend to sort of stay away from the words of like, you shall do this, you shall do that, because I find that regulatory compliance checkboxes, they get stale over time. And sometimes they don't even fit every single use case or problem that may be facing, but they are a pretty good start and they should be used as a tool for folks to review, at least to get them thinking about possible solutions. That would be some of my thoughts. What about yours?
Yeah. And they come and take my interviewer card away now if I don't mention AI in the conversation. So talk to us what these you can do with people. What are the negatives and the hopes that you have for AI in helping to make civic infrastructure more secure?
Mm-hmm. I have some high hopes, definitely in the optimist camp here. I think that traditionally security has been seen as this elusive, really hard to grasp or understand or obtain concept, usually reserved for like the big enterprise organizations who've got the big dollars or the big, headcount teams to invest in it. I think that AI is really going to change that. And it's going to start to democratize security a little bit. And I think that there's going to be a lot of technology that's going to be built and powered and enabled by AI that can be used by everyone, small to medium-sized businesses, civic infrastructure, owners, operators. Think about having like a little chatbot that's sort of tuned just for your facility and is always constantly monitoring and reviewing any of the vulnerabilities. Maybe it's automatically even patching them. Who knows where the future is going to take us on the optimistic side. On the negative side with AI, I think that the attacks are only going to get more and more complicated to detect. They're going to become way more intense. Bad actors are already investing in AI to find vulnerabilities and zero-day exploits in some of our critical infrastructure. And they're going to want to continue to do that. We're seeing a lot of investment in like AI-powered fuzzing. That's when you put in a lot of random inputs into a particular process in order to try to find out how it works to find a vulnerability. And we're seeing that AI could actually be used to find a lot of these zero-day vulnerabilities and exploits in some of the systems that we use every single day. So AI could be, the next crazy hacker out there. And when we talk about, AI taking my job, maybe there's going to be some AI hackers there that take my job eventually.
Well, keep a good thought. We did this in reverse. You're supposed to end with the hopeful part. You do know that, right?
Yeah. Yep. I hear
It's
you.
okay.
I hear you.
It's an occupational hazard in there. Okay, Nick, thank you for taking me on this hacker's tour of the Civic infrastructure. I really appreciate it. I thought it was a fun thing to try out. I'm glad you wanted to play along.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Jim.
And that was our hacker's guide to Civic infrastructure. I hope it made you think. I'll be back with the latest news on Monday morning. I'm your host, Jim Love. Enjoy your weekend.